Hi, Misha here, and we're chewing our way through the Imperial Japanese fleet from World War II in this multiple part series in which I go over the history while using Eaglemoss 1100 scale diecast models to give you something to look at, if not necessarily me, or alternatively a series where I butcher Japanese names. I apologize, but, well, when your life is spent listening to a screen reader, it happens. Also, the problem is a lot of the names online for these are written with Japanese characters, and my speech skips that character completely when it's reading the word. So like the Mishaco class, or Mishaco class we looked at earlier, it reads as Meek, M, because it only reads the M-Y-K. The two O types it just ignores because they're not in the Latin, the English alphabet it's aware of. Anyway, just a little thing. On to the video. This is going to be basically two parts looking at Japanese light cruisers. We already looked at heavy cruisers, several of them. And we actually already looked at the Mogami class here, which I brought back out because originally they were commissioned as light cruisers, although it was just a technicality. Because what is a light cruiser? What's the difference between a light cruiser and a heavy cruiser? Well, the cruiser concept sprung from it began as the protected cruiser, which just had an armored deck. That evolved into the armored cruiser, which had belt armor. And these evolved into the more modern cruisers of World War I and the World War II period. These ships could operate independently all around the world. They didn't need support ships. They didn't have short range. They could, travel from port to port doing the thing. And typically, they were multiple thousands of tons, somewhere between, on the very low end, 3,000, and on the very high end, a little over 10. The tonnage really doesn't matter. You'd think heavy and light it would. Not really. The best definition for heavy and light cruisers is found in 1930 in the London Naval Treaty. In that, both heavy and light are restricted to 10,000 tons or less. The difference, as defined by the London Naval Treaty, are the guns, the main guns. Typically, a light cruiser will have main guns 5 inches or larger, and the treaty defined the maximum allowed size as 6.1 inches, with 5.5 and 6 inch being the most common. Whereas heavy cruisers typically had guns up to about 8 inches. That's why with the Mogamis here, they originally would commission them with 6.1 inch guns in triple turrets. But as soon as they said nuts to the London Naval Treaty, the second one to be exact, they ripped those off and they put on 8 inch guns. So even though they actually had fewer guns, they're more capable. So yeah, the difference between light and heavy technically is just the armament. The overall size and weight, not so much. So with that long preamble, what do we have here? We have Japan's first light cruisers, really, modern cruisers at any rate, and they're all very similar. We start off with the Tenryu class. This was really Japan's first light cruiser. Design began in World War I, and they were in service in the 1920s. Next we went to the larger and more capable Kuma class. Then the next two are just evolutions of the same hull. The Kumano was a 5,500 ton nominal hull. Now the next two are the same. We have the Nagara class and the Sendai class, which is kind of the final one in this particular series. So these three are all 5.5k tons, with the Tenryu being the smaller and obviously the least capable. The Tenryu has 4 main guns, whereas these have 7. So yeah, we'll talk a bit about each one. These models here, it's kind of funny. The Tenryu and the Kumano for 1940, so technically the latest versions. Then the Nagara is from 1936, and the actual most recent design is the most earliest configuration. The Sendai is a 1933 configuration. So chronologically, they kind of work backwards. I've noticed that Eaglemoss kind of likes to do that. Well, with that, let's dive into it. Alright, the Tenryū class. This is actually Tatsuta, and it could be considered to be the real name of the class, because while Tenryu was planned first, actually Tatsuta was launched first and had a longer career. Anyway, this light cruiser was the first light cruiser. As I said in the heavy cruiser video, they kind of call those A classes or whatnot. Well, these would be B classes or second classes. And the idea was to have a ship that was kind of in between a destroyer and a full-size cruiser. It was to be used as kind of a flagship, a command ship for destroyer flotillas, also maybe submarine flotillas. To that end, it was right around 4,000 tons. And it was right at 470 feet long, with a crew in the 300 to 330 range. And had 4 main guns. They were 5.5 inchers. They were in 4 mounts, single mounts. And unfortunately, the way they were arranged, it really limited the firing arcs and whatnot. As for air defense, they only had one 3.1 inch gun and a couple of machine guns, at least initially. And for torpedoes, they had 3 tubes on each side. Now this, the design was kind of worked through in 1915 and was funded and ordered by the government in 1916, and they initially ordered 8. And construction began in 1917. There's a lot of British influence at this point. If you look at like the Congo and stuff and just all the earlier ships, it's no wonder why. And this was still pretty early days for the Japanese marine industry. But the first 2 ships, Tenryu and Tatsuta, were launched in 1919. And even though 8 were ordered, the other 6 were actually pretty quickly canceled because the ship had problems. Not to the point it was unusable, but it was 33 knots top speed, and when it was designed in 1915, that was acceptable. But by the 1920s, this was slower than most destroyers, meaning it wasn't a lot of good if its squadron it was supposed to be leading was several knots ahead of it. Also, yeah, it had pretty weak anti-aircraft armament. So what? Most ships of that era did. But the problem is the hull was so small, there was not really a lot that could be added. And as I said, the main guns, the firing arc was pretty poor. And there were some hull issues, because basically this isn't a cruiser hull, it's an enlarged destroyer hull. Again, it really is on the edge of light cruiser versus heavy destroyer. It's really one of the lightest cruisers fielded. So yeah, the last ones were canceled and the design would be reworked. But these were still kept in service. In fact, in the early 30s, the two ships would be reconstructed a bit to improve their handling, kind of do away with a bit of top heaviness and imbalance, and add a little more seaworthiness. More armor was added in 1936, especially to the bridge. And they would, of course, get more anti-aircraft guns. The original 7.7 machine guns would be updated to 13 millimeters. And later, of course, they would start sticking 25 millimeters all over the place as best they could. But on these, unfortunately, there was only a couple. And more unfortunately, it was the 25 millimeters, so woohoo. Yeah. There wasn't a lot they could do with them. They used them pretty extensively in the 1930s during the Second Sino-Japanese War, 1937, 1938. And the ships were refit as best they could in 1940. And early on in World War II, December 41 through the beginning of 1942, they were used in quite a few places like Wake Island and the Solomon Islands campaign. But at this point, in 1942, they were considered second-line, non-combatant ships, honestly. Tenryu would actually be torpedoed in late 1942. Tatsuta would go into Japanese home waters for training duties and patrol guard duties in 1943, so she was pretty safe, and she probably should have stayed there. By the way, Tenryu was lost at the naval battle of the Guadalcanal. Anyway, but once she left home waters in 1944, she was tracked down and torpedoed by a submarine. I believe it was in March of 44. It is worth pointing out that Tenryu did have one confirmed kill. She did torpedo and sink the USS Quincy, an American cruiser. So that's something. Not bad for a ship of her age. And again, not a bad design considering the Japanese industry was still developing, still learning, and had a long way to go. But it was just designed at a time of pretty rapid naval progress and was quickly left behind, hence why they only made a couple of them and moved on to bigger and better things. The Kuma class. Well, already by the end of 1917 it was clear the Tenryu class wasn't going to work out, so that's why the last 6 were canceled. In their place, 5 of a new class were ordered. Now, the Tenryu wasn't the only one to be canceled. Remember, the Tenryu is going to be kind of a step between a destroyer and a light cruiser, a flagship for destroyers. Another design, they had a plan for a fast, long-range scout cruiser. It was canceled too. Instead, the two concepts were combined into an intermediate cruiser, Kuma. And it would be a 5,500-ton hull, which proved to be quite successful. She would go from 4 5.5-inch main guns from the Tenryu class to 7 5.5-inch main guns, still in single mounts, but now she can fire up to 3 in the rear, 2 in the front, and she has 2 kind of on the sides, the wings, giving her much more of a broadside. Her anti-aircraft armament was increased to 2 of the 3.1-inch guns. It still has 2 machine guns initially. Although, like any of these, they would get 13mm machine guns and then 25mm guns. And thanks to the larger hull, they could put more on her during World War II. This is around 530 feet long. And she had a crew of around 450. So over 100 more. She primarily had oil burning boilers, but she had a couple that were a coal-oil mix. Kind of interesting, I thought. And her max speed was acceptable at 36 knots. So she was designed either for long-range scout patrol missions or to direct squadrons of smaller ships. And the first of these were coming online around 1920 and would be produced up there around 1924. Again, they would build 5. In the late 20s, early 30s, they would actually fit them with a catapult, and they would commonly carry one E-7K1 float plane for scouting duties. After that, much like the Tenryūs, they would get updated armor plating for the bridge and other areas in the superstructure. And then, of course, they would get more and more AA guns between the late 30s and right before World War II. But, of course, never what you'd really consider adequate. But this was considered at least a capable design even into the war period. Still had some uses. It's worth pointing out that all of the ships were modernized, changed, updated during World War II. They would have one or more of their turrets pulled off to replace, usually with triple anti-aircraft mounts. One was actually turned into a carrier for the Kaitan suicide torpedo, although it never actually did this because late war Japan. In the 30s, they had all kinds of concepts, and one was to make a couple into these crazy torpedo cruisers. They would mount 20 torpedo tubes per side for a total of 40, and the idea was to rush in at night and soften up much larger enemy ships with a big torpedo banzai charge, doing damage, rushing out, and then having the main Japanese fleet of heavy cruisers and battleships come in the next day and mop up the remainder. This was an idea in the 30s. Finally, in 1941, funding was originally done for 3 to be converted. Ultimately, this was only 2 through lack of enough torpedoes. This was using the new Type 93 Long Lance 24-inch torpedo. Very capable torpedo. They would convert 2 in 1941. But already by 1942, there was a debate as to the validity of this whole idea because of new things like radar and aircraft that they could actually detect you at night and just, new things. So already by August, September of 1942, the ships were refit again, having all those tubes pulled off and turned into rapid transports. And instead of torpedo tubes, they would actually get landing craft. Kind of an interesting use, I thought. So on and so forth. There was also talk about converting a couple into dedicated anti-aircraft vessels, something you see a lot by 1944 because, let's be honest, the Imperial Japanese Navy had essentially no air cover the last 2 years of the war, so yeah, the best they could hope for was to just give lots of guns to their ships. Again, unfortunately, it was the gun that had a 15-round magazine. Think about that. The 25mm anti-aircraft gun had a magazine that would nearly be legal in the state of California today. Yeah. So what about the individual ships in this class? Kuma herself would be used early in World War II to support various landings, be in various engagements. 43, she would go in for refit, and then she would come out of refit in time to be torpedoed in 1944 by a U.S. submarine. Her sister ships Tama and Kaizo would actually mostly serve together early on in northern waters, during the Aleutians campaigns. Then they too would be recalled for refit in 1943, and both would be sent in 1944 in October in defense of the Philippines to try to repulse the American invasion or retaking of the Philippines. Tama would be severely damaged at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, eventually having to be scuttled. Kizo would actually survive the main battle and then be stationed there as a guard ship in November, but then she would be attacked and sunk on November 15th. So she would not see out the end of 1944. As for the other two ships in the class, IE and Katai Kemi, those would be the two lucky ones turned into those weird torpedo cruisers in 1941. They would both be used during the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, and then turned into fast transports later that summer. And that's pretty much what they would do that year and into 1943. They would operate around the Solomons, delivering supplies, troops, whatever happens. Also patrol as needed. Kemi would be torpedoed in January of 1944. This would actually be her lucky break, and she'd be the only one who would survive the war. But OE would continue on. She would get torpedoed in September of 1944 and was sunk by a U.S. sub. But Kemi would be sent back to Japan. She was severely damaged, but still salvageable. They would turn her into a Kaiten suicide torpedo carrier, basically kamikaze torpedoes. But by the time she was ready, this wasn't going to happen. They didn't have the fuel, the manpower. So she would stay pretty much in home waters and be there at the end of the war, and eventually be scrapped in 1947. So 5-1 managed to survive the war. The Kuma class was quite decent, but I think its main contribution was how its design influenced the next two. The Nagara class, very similar to Kumana. In fact, originally, when these were first ordered, they ordered 3 more 5.5 K-ton cruisers in early mid-1920, and they were just considered modified Kumana types. They did have a few technologies that were new, and they had a few improvements based on what they'd already learned. But the real big difference was that they had just developed a new torpedo, the 24-inch torpedo. Now this wasn't the long lance, that was much later. But they've been using the 21 like many other nations. Well, they went to the 24, larger warhead, more range, so on and so forth. And so this new type was meant to take advantage of it. It would have 8 tubes for it. Well, they decided, originally they did, like I said, they'd ordered 3 in the 8-4 fleet plan. Well, this was updated to a new plan, so at the end of 1920 they would order 3 more, meaning 6. And at this point, having 6 of them, they decided to go ahead and name it after the first ship, Nagara, in the class. And she would go into service beginning in 1922. and the other 5 would actually all be built. None would be canceled. Her specs are otherwise the same as Kuma. They are about 530 feet long, crew of 450, about 36 knots, 7 5.5-inch main battery guns and single mounts. One thing that was new to these, they were built initially with a fly-off deck for an early biplane and a 33-foot hangar for it. Initially it was in the front. Later this would be replaced by a catapult, and then in the early 30s they would actually move it towards the rear for logistical and just practical reasons. So this was one of the first to be fitted from the outset to fly a reconnaissance aircraft floatplane. This is actually pretty important to Japanese fleet doctrine because they would always kind of saddle their cruisers with that duty. Reconnaissance, scouting, patrol would fall to the planes from the cruisers, meaning that the fleet carriers could carry fighters, torpedo, and dive bombers. I found it kind of interesting. And so yeah, these would join the fleet and pretty much have the same specs otherwise, and all would serve. By 1943, of the 6, 5 were still in service, and like all the other cruisers, they would get updated anti-aircraft defense, and the Nagaras would all get radar mid-war. Kind of important, especially as, again, the air cover was dissipating very rapidly. So, what about a few highlights of their individual service? The class actually had a pretty active career in World War II, such as it was. They were all used early on, December 1941, early 1942, to support various landings, invasions. Now, Nagara here was sent in with the main carrier task force during the Battle of Midway, and after the loss of the carrier Akagi, the admiral would use a destroyer for a minute, and then he would transfer his flag over to the cruiser here to beat a escape. So she was briefly a flagship. She would continue on to several battles: Santa Cruz, Eastern Solomons. During the Battle of Guadalcanal, the naval one, she actually was credited with sinking a U.S. destroyer, USS Preston. But it wouldn't last for all that long, because in 1944, in early August, she would be torpedoed and sunk by an Allied submarine. So what about her sister ships? Well, Tenryu did much the same thing, supported landings. She was credited with helping sink the British ships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. And then she would go on herself to be sunk at the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 26, 1944. Between the 24th and 26th, it was pretty hard times for the Japanese Navy. Another one of their sisters, Nagara, would help sink the USS Houston and Australian Perth. And for a time she would be doing her thing, but she would sink just over a week after Nagara here, being sunk again by a U.S. submarine in mid-August of 1944. So yeah, you can tell the subs are out for blood at this point, especially for ships like this that took their toll. Their sister ship, Ura, also helped sink Prince of Wales and repulse. And next she would be at the Battle of Midway, but her victory would be short-lived because she would be sunk during the naval battle of Guadalcanal in October 1942. Well, technically she would just be severely damaged by bombers, but she'd have to be scuttled. So she was gone. Next we have Abu Kuma. She was there as an escort during the Pearl Harbor attack. Afterwards, she would be sent into northern waters and operating up there for quite some time. And then she would be transferred back south in October 1944 to try to repel the American retaking of the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Surigao Strait, but she would actually be severely damaged by an American PT boat, patrol torpedo boat, and then after that, hit by several bombs from aircraft and sink. I believe it was on October 26th. But anyway, so we have one, Isuzu. She would have a much more fortunate time, though she would be severely damaged in 1943 by aircraft. She would make it back to port, back to Japan, and be refit into an anti-aircraft cruiser and anti-submarine patrol craft in 1944. She too would be sent to the battle for the Philippines, Leyte Gulf, and she would survive. She would even survive that November. She would survive through the winter and even spring of 1945. But on April 7th, 1945, her number was up. Smelling blood, a wolf pack of 3 U.S. and 1 British submarine pretty much tracked her down, cornered her, and put a bunch of holes in her. So she did not survive the war. And that is the Nagara class. And we have one more 5,500 ton cruiser, the Sendai class. The Sendai class, still considered a 5,500 ton cruiser, it was actually a little bit lighter than the predecessors. This is because it had new, more modern boilers. It also has 4 funnels instead of 3. And it too, like Nagara, was built with a fly-off platform for a reconnaissance aircraft. Now, they ordered originally 4 in 1921, and then an additional 4 in 1922. They were planning for 8. The original 4 had been laid down and were under construction, but then Japan signed the Washington Naval Treaty, and because of tonnage limits, first they had to cancel the unbuilt, the not yet started 4, and then they also had to cancel the fourth one. They went ahead and finished the first 3 that were further along. They could have finished the 4th one, but that would have counted towards their overall tonnage. And after Japan signed the naval treaty, they decided to focus on heavy cruisers, and that's where the Furutakas come in, which I've done a pretty long video on, the Furutakas and the Erebus, which leads to everything else. So Japan's changing attitudes were influenced by the treaty, thus ending the Sendai class, which, to be fair, was very similar, just again with more updated tech. They still used the 24-inch torpedo. They had 8 tubes, 1 reload each, so a total of 16 torpedoes on board. They had the same 33-foot hangar, but it was actually never used. Now, they did install a catapult on the ships beginning in the early 1930s, and then they started operating reconnaissance float planes that away. Interestingly, she's a little bit slower at about 35 to 35.5 knots. She has a slightly smaller crew of 440, but most of that has to do with the fact that the more modern boilers were a little less labor intensive. Still has the 5.5 inch guns, although in World War II, one of these would usually be removed and replaced with anti-aircraft mounts. She, like the others, would start off with machine guns and then be upgraded to 13 millimeters and then 25 millimeters and then adding more and more. You know the deal by now. And doing the cruiser thing. There's not a lot to say feature-wise about this one because it's pretty much our same design. Now, this model from Eaglemoss is from 1933. So, kind of neat that it's an early version. Well before the World War II updates. And it was the last in its lineage, really. No more 5,500 ton cruisers for Japan. Sendai and her sister ships, Naka and Tenryu, would do like all the other cruisers in early World War II. They would cover landings, serve as transports, serve as escorts, command flotillas. You know the drill by now. The first to be lost would be Tenryu, who would be shelled by American cruisers in July of 1943 and eventually sent to the bottom. Sendai would have a very similar fate 4 months later in November. Again, should be cornered by American cruisers, shelled and sent down. Naka would last a little longer, but in February of 1944, Allied aircraft during a patrol raid would bomb her and sink her, and she wasn't that far from Japanese truck. But it just goes to show you by 44 how close the Allies were really getting. So all three would be lost in the war. And yeah, it's clear that no matter how many of those 25 millimeter guns and 13 millimeter machine guns they had, it wasn't air defense. The Japanese just had very poor medium class air defense. To be fair, a lot of the other Allied participants did too, but they learned. Japan, it's unusual. I know it's kind of baffled a lot of people, but it is what it is. And with that, we have finished up the first series of light cruisers, the smaller, the ones from the 1920s. I could have broke this up into several pieces, but it just seemed wiser to do one big long video because they are so similar. And I know these aren't the big fleet carriers or the big battleships like Yamato or Musashi, but I hope you enjoyed it. Sometimes it's the little ships, and again, like Nagara and Kuma, they really got around. They were at a lot of places, including being flagships sometimes. But there you have it. Next time we'll cover a little more diverse cast of ships. So, hope you tune in then. Any questions or comments, please post them. And I hope I got the right ship on the stand. I might have mixed them up. As you can imagine, they're extremely similar, and I'm blind, so I do my best to distinguish which is which. If I mix it up, which I will do sometimes, sorry. I thought about trying to print out braille labels and put them on the bottom, but it's a lot of effort. And what if I get the labels wrong? I don't know. It is what it is. But I enjoy learning about them and handling them. For me, it's very neat, so I hope you enjoyed it too. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon with more cruisers next time.